Okay. Gosh, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to follow that. Um, I want to start by thanking Pavel and the entire conference team for organizing this. I know it takes a ton of work. So thanks for inviting me and thanks for creating this wonderful space for all of us. And actually to everybody who's created it over the years. Many of you are in this building. In the room right now. I also want to take the opportunity to thank um, all of the incredible collaborators, mentors, and friends without whom this talk, my research, none of this would be possible for your intellectual support, emotional, psychological, all of it. Without you, I mean, it wouldn't be any fun either. So yeah, wanted to say that. And these are just a few of the people. There's many, many more. I couldn't fit them all on one slide, but some of the people that have really supported me over the years. And of course, most importantly, all of you for being here. Because without you, none of this would be possible. So thank you for coming. Thank you for your research, which I avidly read and cite. Yeah, without you, we wouldn't have the community we have. And that's what's special to me. So a few opening remarks. Just want to talk to you a little bit about who I am as a researcher and a language learner and teacher. So you understand where I'm coming from in this talk. I do quantitative research. I was trained kind of on the cognitive side of linguistics. I'm interested in everything, but that's kind of my background. And I'm certainly interested in research methods, so that's kind of what I'll be talking about today. And then as a language learner and teacher, I am a learner of Spanish, and I've studied French and Catalan. I've been trying to resurrect my French here. Sometimes Catalan comes out. We can talk about why that happens if you want. I'm a former Spanish language program director as well. And so for me, it's super important that we have actionable information and practical activities, right? Not just telling instructors what works, but helping them implement those things and making it practical because we're all quite busy. And nobody just wants to be told to do more and more and more and then be told to figure it out on top of that. And so today's talk, I'll be focusing a bit more on how and what we research as opposed to what we have found. I will talk about that too, but focusing on how we do what we do. And really today I'm making a pitch to you in two parts. So in the first part, I'm going to talk about sort of the catalysts or the ingredients that have set the stage for the initiative I'm launching today, or our team is launching, called the Pronunciation Research Accelerator. And then I got to talk about our love affair with high variability phonetic training as an ideal first project and build a case for that. So jumping right in, open science. The open science movement has been a really important ingredient or catalyst. And really it dates back to it's been running for what, 15 years or so now in our field, starting with the creation of IRIS, the IRIS database. And I think that was around 2010, 2011. And then 2012, 2013, the Open Science Framework came online, followed immediately by the Center for Open Science. And that's the organization, by the way, that awards those badges that come with journals for like open data, open materials, and so on. And then fast forward to the past few years, really, in my mind, the applied psycholinguistics replication package was groundbreaking and a model I follow. So thank you for bringing that online, those of you that contributed. And then most recently, the SSLA data reports. So broadening the scope of what we publish and what we talk about beyond just the traditional research report. Not that there's anything wrong with the traditional report. Okay. Alongside this open science movement, there's been a methodological movement, a methodological turn, if you will. That probably predates the open science movement, but I see them as dovetailing, going hand in hand. And we can see that through a few field-wide initiatives. So that's what I've focused on in these slides. The SSLA Methods Forum, the Language Learning Methods Showcase, and in 2021, I believe, Research Methods in Applied Linguistics, or RIML. That's a journal that came online that is exclusively dedicated to research methods. So lots of interesting things going on in sort of the open science and methodological world. And this is the case in pronunciation too. We're participating in this. So I think of replication and multi-site replication as really strong dimensions of the open science movement and the methodological movement. And I've just kind of given you a few references in each of these areas. And crucially, I think all of these references have a very strong open science component in addition to the dimensions articulated here. So they've made their materials or data available and so on. And that's my paper, our recent paper in applied psycholinguistics is thanks to the people that created that replication package and that model for us. Okay. But in my view, open science can be distilled into kind of two fundamental questions. The first being, are methods transparent and reproducible? And that's articulated in two ways, that in the tasks, protocols, and coding schemes we use. And I think we're doing a pretty good job, we can debate that, of making these things available. Certainly the tasks, that's always been the bedrock of the IRIS database, is getting tasks on there. But we're getting better at publishing those procedural elements, like the protocols, the coding schemes, the sal and pimienta, if you will, of everything we do that can't necessarily go into the research report, into what gets published. And I love this quote from these authors. Emma Marsden was part of this team. They said, and this is a strong reminder of why we should be doing this, right? The life cycle of any research study is beset by a series of decisions, many of which are essentially arbitrary, right? And I don't think that's an indictment of our field. I think that's a recognition of the fact that what we do is really complicated, and making research decisions is complicated. So we have all of our conceptual grounding and so on, but then there's a practical reality of actually doing the thing. And sometimes that necessitates a shift in what we do. Okay, so I don't think it's an indictment. And by the way, this question is also kind of percolated into the data space in terms of how we process and analyze the data. And many of you may be familiar with this Coretta et al. Paper, this mini lab study. Several of you probably participated in it. I'm a big fan. I didn't participate, but big fan. And they said, after sort of reviewing the methods people used, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a second, idiosyncratic variation across researchers might be a fact of life that we have to acknowledge and integrate into how we evaluate and present evidence. So again, not an indictment, but things we have to keep in mind. And there's a tension between sort of our individual research programs and the big team science model that I think we need to adopt. We need to add to our program. So that's the pitch I'm going to make to you today. Please keep this in mind during the talk. Let me just tell you a little bit about more about that Coretta et al. Study, because I'm such a fan. So what the project leads did was they gave researchers speech production data. So they had already collected that data. And they asked them to use that data to answer the same research question. And that question was, do speakers acoustically modify utterances to signal atypical word combinations? So like yellow banana versus blue banana, and so on. The researchers were free to choose the window of their analysis, so whether they were looking at a particular segment or syllable, word, any level of analysis in terms of like the temporal scope, the acoustic outcome they analyzed, and the statistical models they fit. And so the 46 teams participated, encompassing 211 individuals. And once you kind of worked out what everybody did, once the authors worked that out, they found 2,860 combinations. And that's just from the analysis forward. So imagine if we backed that up and said, here's the question, go design a study to address that. It would be exponentially more variations on that theme, right? Again, not a problem per se, but something we have to be aware of, okay? The other fundamental question for open science is, and I think we're used to thinking about this one maybe a bit more, is do our findings generalize? And here generalization can be conceptualized along many different dimensions. The one we're used to thinking of is speakers or participants. right? That's super important because if we design something, we want it to work not just for the sample that we've designed it for and tested it with, but for other samples. And so we can think of sort of degrees of freedom, to use the Coretta et al. Language, the researcher degrees of freedom, study degrees of freedom, to think about, well, are findings going to generalize to a new highly similar sample? And the answer is probably. But to a new, quite different sample, thinking about the range of characteristics that could be included in sampling, maybe so, maybe not. And so we can sort of establish a continuum where if we're thinking about instructed L2 learners of some language, it could be Spanish in my case, because that's what I teach, but I research other languages as well. It's probably going to generalize well to other instructed learners of that language, maybe less well to instructed learners of other languages, depending on sort of their relationship to the original language. And then there's context too, right? So we're talking about instructed, but we could also think about immersion learners. And so we can think about context of learning, or context in a more local sense in terms of the literal site where the research is conducted, as an important dimension of generalization, right? So people in a similar context, we would expect it to generalize, but perhaps not in other contexts, right? Keep that in mind because that'll be really important for the multi-site thing I'm going to talk about shortly. And then, not to belabor this point, but I got excited and I like making slides, so I made some more on this topic. But we can also ask this about items as well, right? So thinking about items, especially important for that high variability phonetic training research, where we train people on using a certain set of items produced by a certain set of talkers, and then we ask questions about whether or not people's learning will generalize to the same items produced by new talkers or new items produced by new talkers, and so on. And by the way, I just realized I'm treating this as a binary yes, no. That could be the case, but what we're really talking about are differences of magnitude, right? So how well does learning transfer? And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. And then just to round out the picture, we can ask the same contextual questions, applying it to the items we use, thinking about the phonetic context and so on. Okay. And so I think we've got to harness this potential. And I love this quote from this Morgan Short et al. Paper, where it was a multi-site replication study, not on pronunciation, but I just love this paper and think they're great researchers. So they said direct replication affords the field a crucial opportunity to verify previously published findings, and doing so through a multi-site approach may be particularly valuable because it allows one to isolate the signal from the noise, or to understand how the extent to which our observed effects are going to vary. Right? How effective is that treatment? I care if it's effective at the site where I implement the research, but the thing I really want to know is how effective it would be at all of our sites, right? That's the thing I want to get to. And I'm not necessarily I think direct replication is great. I'm not necessarily advocating for direct replication as such. The thing I'm advocating for is applying these principles within a multi-site approach to produce a set of studies that are maximally comparable while still offering us enough sort of researcher degrees of freedom for individualization. Okay. And so what we need is not just another idea, we need a model to make this work. And I think that model needs to be based on coordinated methods and procedures. It needs to be multi-site. And there's some things we get with multi-site studies that we sort of get automatically in a way that I think are advantageous. And then the really interesting part is all of the geographic, socio-demographic, sociocultural variation associated with context that the other plenary speaker that Susie talked about yesterday that I'm not addressing fully here, but super important there. And really interesting questions can be asked at that level that cannot be asked at the individual level. And then crucially, big team speech science, I think, is what we need. So we've gotten really good at working by ourselves. Well, we've always kind of been good at that because academia has forced us into single authorship. But we've gotten good at working in teams of 2 to 5 researchers, maybe larger teams. That Coretta et al. Mini lab studies an exception. But we need to get good at working with all of us, like huge groups. And that's advantageous because we're going to get those more precise estimates, but we're going to understand how things vary across sites, samples, target structures, and so on. And so just to summarize why I think we should do this before I talk to you about it, there's some definite scientific benefits for our field or subfield. That's what I just mentioned. There are scientific benefits because it will connect us to other fields, such as discussions happening in cognitive science, educational psychology, and so on. And then the sort of the emotional side, if you will, the social and practical. We've been discussing this at PSLT for years. We're a supportive community, and frankly, doing good science is hard, and it takes a village. So, we are the village. Let's do this together, right? So, hence the need for what I'm calling the Pronunciation Research Accelerator. And the mission of this organization or initiative is to create an international network to bind us together in a way. I mean, we're already bound by PSLT, but to create a space where we can collaborate, and people at all stages of their careers in all places, creating sort of an equitable research space feels really important to me. And then fostering that big team collaborative speech science into key topics that not only represent our shared interests, that's important, because I mean, I'm a nerd and I like to research what I like to research, right? But they've got to be topics that have the potential to bridge the research practice or research policy divide. And by the way, I think just by engaging in big team speech science, we can start doing that more effectively. Okay. So let me tell you about the sort of this organization and how it's currently conceptualized. There's 3 ways to contribute. Currently, there's an advisory board, and those people are kind of responsible for what you would expect, the governance, procedural documents, trying to drum up funding, organizational and logistical support. But crucially, we're going to be putting out calls for proposals. And that the advisory board will sort of do a quick initial evaluation to make sure they're viable before putting them out to the community for a vote, right? Because what we do should be dictated by our shared interests. Then there will be the project leads. Those are the people that are submitting project proposals, and they're going to be the liaison kind of between the advisory board and the individual teams, working with the advisory board to make sure that materials are documented and archived properly. This is an open science initiative after all. And then working with the teams to ensure timely completion of project milestones. And then the project teams, those are the most important people. Those are the people doing the work. It's you, it's me, right? And so they'll be collaborating in the development and pre-registration of project materials and responsible for local data collection, any pre-processing that needs to happen, and then submission for data aggregation and analysis. Okay, the advisory board, I'm very happy to report initially are these individuals. So Amanda Hinch and Pavel Trofimovich have graciously offered their time and expertise. There's going to be plenty of opportunity for individuals who want to contribute at the organizational level. I will be reaching out to some of you with asks. So be prepared for those emails. Hoping to get you excited about this, as excited as I am. And then there's also going to be some what I'm calling area experts right now. People who have really deep knowledge in certain areas and like superpowers in the research space. Shelby Brune is here. She's right there. She is an expert at many things, but she has like her superpower is Gorilla, the research management platform, and thinking about logistics and things like that. So you could be here. I'm making the pitch. And I'm super happy to announce that Gorilla has agreed to fund us initially. They're going to help us out. And so let me say a few words about our sponsor. in case you don't know about Gorilla. So it's this website here, www.gorilla.sc. It's basically an experiment management platform. I think some of the advantages of it are it's a really easy to use tool. It's relatively point and click. Um, and so it's easy to get going. Their vision kind of meshes with ours, so create a better world based on evidence. That's what we're trying to do, and pronunciation. And then they're really into reducing barriers to doing research, right? So making it as easy as possible. Okay, and so what they've agreed to initially is a department basic subscription, which by the way costs about $6,000 a year, so it's not nothing. And that's going to give 200 users, we're the users, the researchers, access to the platform. And we're going to be able to run 5,000 participants a year. Okay. And then they've agreed to a 4-year staggered model with ramp up to full payment. So initially I'm paying for it for us, and I'm happy to do that. To enable this. And so so that's this sort of Gorilla perspective. My perspective on why we should use Gorilla, like I said, it makes us super easy to develop, export, and deploy globally. And so we can build a task and then push it out to everyone, right? So then we ensure that things are being implemented consistently and we're not reinventing the wheel at each site. And they're hyper responsive to researcher feedback. So they provide workarounds, or sometimes they frankly just hard code something we need into their system, which is really nice. And we're doing this. People in the field are already using Gorilla, already publishing Gorilla tasks. So if you're familiar with SLA speech tools, they have tools for researchers, and many of those tools have been created in Gorilla and can be pushed out to researchers. So we're kind of used to working in Gorilla. And if not, don't worry. It's very easy. We can help you. So in terms of how do you become a member and what are the incentives, right? Well, it's very easy. It's free and open to anyone doing L2 speech research. The only thing we ask is that you participate, right? So we would like to have active members who are participating in one project every 3 years. There will be other ways to get involved, so stay tuned for that. And the incentives, well, we're cool, right? Join this lively and supportive research community. You'll get support. We'll be able to provide you with Gorilla and some seats to run the study. So you're not going to have to generate all of this sort of architecture on your own, pay for that on your own. And I'm trying to figure out a way to get grants going so we can give people money, small grants to pay participants and sort of some of the other soft funding that's required. Stay tuned. I'm trying to figure that part out. How am I doing time-wise? Oh, okay, I'm pretty good. Don't get overwhelmed by this, but I love making little diagrams. So it's going to be a 2-year project cycle. And so on the left side, I just want to prove that I've thought about this on some level. On the left side, you have the tasks for the project running down that leftmost column. And then you have the academic year broken into fall, spring, and summer. And again, don't get bogged down in the details. Basically, there's a ramp up phase where we put out a call for proposals, receive those proposals, the community votes, we launch the project, whatever the most popular project is. There's a run cycle where we design the study, and individual teams collect and submit their data. And then there's a completion phase where data get aggregated, analyzed, and the study is written up. And then that repeats. So every fall, there's a call for proposal. So at any time, we'll have 2 studies running. We have some activities for the organization, things like getting a basic website going, getting the governance documents running, all the way through to launching a professional organization that can fund this and sort of formalize it a bit more. Maybe PSLT can be that organization as well. And then the research activities are what I said before. It's just this is probably an easier way to visualize it, this vote, launch, run cycle of sorts. And this is what it's going to look like, where P refers to projects. So project 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And by the way, this is our initiative. This is for all of us, right? So it's not Charlie's thing. I don't want it to be Charlie's thing. I'm happy to devote time to it, but I want this to be something for all of us. So let me address some concerns that you might have. What we're asking you to do is get involved and add this to your research program. What we're not asking you to do is give up your current research program or make this a sole focus of your research program, right? And then the other thing people say is, well, but like, what if I'm one of 50 authors or something? Well, participating in projects like this demonstrates your strength as a scholar. Remember, if you're a team, you will have your own contribution, right? You'll be making your own contribution. So it'll be very clear what you've done. And you can always log what you've done using something like credit, which for the life of me, I can't remember what that stands for right now, but it's that researcher roles taxonomy, something like that. Okay, that's the pitch. Let me talk to you about our first project, which is high variability phonetic training. So you may be thinking, why is he showing me this random picture called Odd Apples? Well, I'm a fan of Odd Apples. I'm a fan of William Mullen, who created this book. And I'm showing this image to you to convey the idea that lots of people, are interested in variability. We just happen to be interested in variability and the role it plays in speech learning. And I want you to keep this sort of odd apples, high variability apple phonetic tennis training idea in mind, because we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. Okay. So I'm not going to go deep into the HVPT literature. Ron already did that at a previous plenary. And I'm pretty sure a lot of us are somewhat familiar with HVPT. So I'm going to focus more on what we've been doing and our methods as opposed to what we found. I'm going to touch upon findings briefly in like 1 minute. Okay. So this is how I think of HVPT research. There was this initial phase where in the 1990s, Logan and Lively, that set of studies found that talker variability was beneficial for learning. A phase of growing and sustained interest where there was an emphasis really on the talkers and the stimulus characteristics, and people were manipulating the stimuli, acoustically modifying the stimuli to augment or diminish variability along certain dimensions of the speech signal. Lots of interest in that, thinking about how stimulus features can be made more or less variable. A recent phase of scrutiny and expansion. So we reached the critical threshold of research necessary for meta-analysis, research synthesis, and meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is one type of research synthesis. And really, there's been an emphasis on optimizing training features and thinking about the type of variability, how it's structured, and when it's delivered, and how those things independently and synergistically regulate learning. One more plug. And hopefully now there will be phase 4 consisting of big team science. And this will be our first project. So I told you I like to make tables and figures, so bear with me. So here's a list of non-exhaustive list of research syntheses in the field. And the one shown in orange, I chose Halloween colors. The one shown in orange all deal with high variability phonetic training. And so if we reorganize this list a little bit, so this is in reverse chronological order because I love to think about time and when things are happening and why. But if we reorganize this list and topically, we'll see that, that people have been talking about HVPT features and their impact, bridging the gap between research and practice, meta-analyses of the average effect of HVPT, a couple of recent meta-analyses on that topic, and then meta-analyses looking at the sort of internal mechanics of HVPT and what makes it work. And so from these syntheses, so remember that HVPT typically, but not always, is training perception. There is high variability production training, imitation training, but most of the time it's perception. And so we know these meta-analyses, these research syntheses have shown that yes, it's effective at improving perception. It's somewhat effective for improving production. Gains are retained pretty well in perception, not so well in production. So retained well in the trained modality, not so well in the untrained modality. Same applies to generalization. And then so many things affect all of that. But talkers, one thing we can say with some certainty is that multiple talkers seem to be better than single talkers. And there's this interest in talkers. So let's talk about why they're so central to this research paradigm. Because that's the primary dimension along which variability has been realized, right? That's an awkward way of putting it. That we use talkers to make the training set variable, right? So let's talk about that a little bit. And so we're familiar with sort of the single versus multi-talker. That's always been the bedrock of this paradigm. But then there's the way talkers are presented over time. And they can be blocked or interleaved. So if we just have a single talker, there's no interleaving that can take place, at least in the talker dimension, right? It's always one talker. We're always hearing stimuli produced by one talker. Different stimuli, by the way, but stimuli produced by the same individual. In the multi-talker space, we can block or interleave. So here the colors represent different talkers. So there would be 3 here. And in the blocked condition, you'll notice that you're always getting this, hearing the same talker until you switch, right? Whereas in the interleave condition, from one trial to the next, you could hear a stimulus produced by any talker in the training set. And so we can also increase that, right? We can increase the number of talkers from 3 to 5, and so on. Okay. So thinking about number of talkers and talker presentation format and the way that people, so if we sort of take a step back and reorient towards variability, the thing we're talking about is low versus high overall talker variability, and low versus high trial by trial variability, right? So you could have a lot of talkers, but low trial by trial variability because you're blocking the talkers, right? So you always hear Charlie, then you always hear Germán, then you always hear Amanda, then you always hear Julie, and so on, okay? And this high overall by high trial by trial variability is hypothesized, and in some studies has been shown to be detrimental for learning, in the sense that detrimental probably isn't the right word. Actually, it slows learning down. So if you look at the variability literature at large, it shows you, for instance, that single talker in low variability, you learn really fast, you improve a lot, but you don't generalize so well. And high variability, regardless of how it's realized, ignoring sort of all of those variables along which variability can be realized, you tend to learn more slowly, but it tends to be more durable, more generalizable, and so on. This is a fact of variability. Okay. And so I'm thinking here about that Parashon et al. 2011 paper on tonal word learning, where they saw that high trial by trial variability combined with multiple talkers slowed down people's learning of those tonal words. Okay. I said I loved graphics, so here we go again. So we can translate this into a dimensional space and say, okay, well, we have a dimension that's talker variability, and we could randomly plot that on the y-axis. And we have a dimension that's talker trial by trial variability, and we could randomly plot that on the x-axis, right? And we can add to this. So one other dimension of variability could be phonetic context. And by the way, in my reading of the literature, we don't talk about that too much, but that was fundamental to those original studies. They compared training fewer phonetic contexts to more phonetic contexts. We've latched onto talkers, but I want you to know that that was always in the background. And the point I'm trying to make here is that there's a lot of dimensions along which we could realize variability. And so there's different ways we can manipulate the training itself, thinking about variability, thinking about the ways it manifests in the training set, right? And we've been doing that a lot. I've had a lot of fun poring over this literature. These are just some recent examples of the training features we have manipulated. I should say you have manipulated, because y'all have done most of this work. And again, we have to take a step back. So these are the things we manipulated, and they all bear some relationship to variability, right? And so we have to take a step back and think, how do we map these specific variables that we manipulated onto variability as a construct? And I really like this way of talking about it, this Revive et al. 2022 paper, where they talk about numerosity, heterogeneity, contextual diversity, and scheduling. And numerosity refers to set size, so how many things are there. Heterogeneity to differences between examples, contextual diversity, differences related to training conditions, not to the stimuli themselves, and then scheduling differences related to training schedules. And crucially, we could construct a big training set, so a numerous set that's fairly homogeneous, or we could construct a small set that's heterogeneous, right? So those two dimensions in theory are orthogonal, like we can manipulate them independently. So if we take our variables and map them onto here, you can see that we've kind of been looking at different manifestations of variability, all of these manifestations of variability. But the thing I want us to concentrate on is the number of talkers. Sorry, I'm looking at numerosity there. Number of talkers, because we're including more talkers, expecting them to be more heterogeneous, right? To produce a more heterogeneous, therefore a more variable training set. Hang on to that idea because we've got to come back to it. Okay, that may or may not be true. Lots of other things that can moderate HVPT, sort of those procedural decisions that may seem arbitrary. We all have a rationale for them, but could seem arbitrary. Things like number of trials, trials per session, trials per target, certainly tons of participant characteristics and target characteristics related to what specifically is being learned and what that learning challenge implies. And that has been meta-analyzed through using moderator analyses. Almost every meta-analysis talks about these things, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. The point I want to make is that HVPT is a really great inter and intra-disciplinary, that's between and within, discipline bridge. And so certainly, if we look at studies conducted at different sites, coming out of different labs, people of different interests, those studies are going to be different and they're going to differ along many dimensions, along many variables simultaneously, making them kind of hard to compare. Even studies coming from the same site or lab show differences, right? And those are sensible differences for that study when it's conducted. But again, playing with that tension between standardization and individualization that we need to sort of bring into the field. I'm going to skip this for the sake of time. The point I wanted to make is that variability is everywhere, in speech, beyond speech. And so I've just put a few examples here of people researching variability that are not speech related. And my favorite that I discovered recently is this high variability orthographic training using 1 or 3 typefaces in logographic languages. So back to odd apples. Why did I show you this? It's not about the apples, right? It's about variability in their physical manifestation being central to our ability to characterize them as apples. If I showed you some of these, you might think they were potatoes, but they're apples. And that's analogous to the way that variability in speech is critical to our ability to identify categories and the primary acoustic dimensions along which those categories are realized. So that, in my mind, really makes HVPT an ideal candidate for our first project. And so just to summarize, there's some applied reasons why we might be interested in HVPT. There's theoretical reasons connecting us to one another, but connecting us to other areas of speech science and science at large. And then there's some practical ones. Our team has been working on this at UT, at Western Michigan. I think large-scale perception studies are easier to implement initially because then we don't have to deal with production data, coding production data. And I think that HVPT offers room for individualization. So adding individual difference measures at your site if you want, adding a production component if that's something you're personally interested in. And so let me just talk to you a little bit about our work to scale HVPT, because we've tried to do this, think through some of the logistics. And this is our team, plus many, many undergraduate research assistants at UT Austin. And the way I kind of got into this research, apart from just following it, is I started to think, well, we keep comparing a single talker to a multi-talker, and that doesn't make a ton of sense to me. I don't have time to unpack why, but the decision we made is let's compare multi-talker to multi-talker. So let's compare 2 talkers to 6 talkers. That decision was arbitrary, the 2, 6. I'm going to put it out there straight away. And so we started with 2 talkers, these 2 experimental groups, and we gave them 120 trials per session, initially blocked. And then over time, we've sort of expanded to different iterations, different versions of trying to take that systematic approach that I'm advocating for here. And so crucially, we've always kept the groups and the number and timing of sessions constant. The thing we've manipulated is the number of trials per session and then the talker presentation format. Right now we're on a break because we've collected data from about 1,500 people and it's been exhausting. And we're ready to move beyond. We started with stops. I don't have time to talk about why, but we're ready to move beyond stops, right? So we're ready to move to lexical stress, like hablo versus hablo for Spanish speakers in the room. And we've been running this, and it's a classroom study where we do testing in class, training at home. Control group also gets training after testing for learning equity, and everything has been expertly built and configured in Gorilla by Shelby. So I want to give her credit for that, and that's what this looks like. Okay, so because we've had the PSLT versus PSLT debate, I decided to pick a nice sounding acronym for us, which is OPAL. So our first project is going to be called Optimizing Perception Learning, OPAL. And the goals of this project are, as I said, we need to make our sites comparable by fixing certain training features. So implementing training in the same way. We need to make it generalizable by allowing some variability, because if we fix absolutely everything, which is impossible, it won't be generalizable, right? And then we need to crucially create room for individualization so everybody feels like they can participate in this. So to give you an example of what this could look like, we could have a common core of 1, 2, and 4 talker groups. Okay, don't get scared. We can debate all of this. I'm happy to debate these arbitrary decisions. We can train for 6 sessions, 2 times a week with 90 trials per session. There is some advantage to kind of adopting something that looks like this because we already have it configured in Gorilla and we've tested it. And so what we would need to do, it says you, but we, because I'm planning on participating too, if you'll have me, is if you need to record talkers, so you need to get stimuli, we would ask that you record 8 and prepare your stimuli, run your study, and then deliver your data and other required components. You can add things onto this as you would like. And what we're providing is that study architecture in Gorilla, the seats in Gorilla, and happy to provide whatever professional support we can, depending on your needs. Financial, we can't necessarily offer right now, but our time, our energy, our cheerleading, we can offer that until it runs out. And so just to give you a sense of what the timeline looks like, to map it onto the original sort of things I was showing you, that 2-year project cycle, this is kind of how it would break down, right? You would express your interest now and we'd finalize teams and get going. I think I'm going to just skip this for the sake of time because you've already been listening to me for 42 minutes. Oh, I'm doing well on time. 42 minutes. Okay. And just end by saying, you know what? Together we've got this. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. That was great. So we have a few minutes for questions until Pablo, 10 minutes or less. Yeah.
Sir. Oh, thank you so much for asking. See, I thought I wouldn't have time to get to this. It turns out I did. So let me go into my extra slides. So remember we talked about, is Ron Thompson in the room somewhere? Yeah, this is going to resonate with you, Ron, I think. So we talked about number of talkers being, it's a proxy, right? And perhaps it's a good proxy because what we're trying to do, I believe, and getting many talkers is to represent the categories well, right? So the different ways it can be realized across individuals so people can become attuned to the between category differences and ignore those within category differences. So, you know, the way I say beat bit is not the same way y'all are going to say beat bit and so on. So we're using numerosity to get at heterogeneity, but if we don't And we're assuming that more talkers is more heterogeneous and therefore more representative. But the only guarantee we have is that more talkers are more numerous, right? So I really think we've got to understand our stimuli, our training set, and Rachel, y'all's team have talked about this too, I remember. Um, Understand the dimensions along which our stimuli vary and how variable they are within and between talkers. And wouldn't it be great if we could collect, validate, and publish a reusable stimulus set across languages, so for different target structures, rather than every time we're doing a study kind of recollecting the data. And I know many of you already have stimuli available that you've done this for, essentially. So I'm not saying new data collection would always be required, but I'm saying we've got to understand what the acoustic characteristics of the training stimuli are and testing stimuli. And I think that will help us understand when, why, and to what extent things do and don't generalize and are not retained. Because maybe all we need is one really great talker, right? One really representative talker. And maybe that's enough. You know, thanks for that question. Good, good. Yeah, and so yeah, so the question was about proficiency levels, right, for the of the participants, right? Um, Anybody, any proficiency level. I mean, I would trust that y'all working in your context would know kind of the best time to implement this. And I think that part of what I'd like us to do is control kind of what the training looks like, but allow some of those participant characteristics to vary and target structures to vary so that we can, for instance, run this study with people that are beginner, intermediate, maybe advanced, learning diverse target structures, and then take a step back and say, um, did this work for all target structures? Why or why not? Did it work for learners at different proficiency levels? Why or why not? So we need some variability, and that has to be variable because we can't all work on sort of the same learners. We work in different contexts and have different learners with different needs. But I think this is a way to begin to systematize kind of what we know. Yeah. And then the powerful thing too is, we can look at a la Morgan Short et al. What's the average effect across all of our sites? What is the variability around that average effect? Do we observe an effect? Yes, no at all sites. What's the magnitude of the observed effects? So there's a lot of interesting questions we can ask. Yeah, it's a great question. Mhm. You got it. You can dream it, you can do it. Yeah, and we will have sort of a preliminary meeting where we talk about this, so it won't just be like show up and do the thing, don't worry. We'll talk through some of this. Yeah. What would make sense and why, and everything is adjustable. Mhm.
So do you think it's a good idea to enhance speaker variability by using synthetic voices? So assuming the TTS, voice conversion techniques, is quite easy to enhance talk availability.
Yeah, I think it could be, and that's in my reading of our literature, sort of the most proximal literature to us. That's not something we often do, but it is pretty common in other areas of like speech science and cognitive science. I'm thinking of Lori Holt's work, if y'all are familiar with her work. They literally synthesize stimulus sets, and then they know exactly what the variability looks like. So I think that could be an option.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
The thing I think about with that sometimes is what am I going to tell a teacher, right? I can tell a teacher, okay, well, if you can record some people, assuming that number of speakers is a good proxy for variability, which sometimes it might be, right, because of practical considerations. But in this case, perhaps we could synthesize stimulus sets and then make those publicly available too. So I think that's a great idea. I don't have the expertise to do that, but we need area experts. So, feel free to sign up. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Charlie. A
Thank
big
you.
round of applause for a wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Oh, sign up, please.
Thank you again, Charlie. Thank you, Herman, for introducing Charlie. And we're inviting everybody to continue conversations over coffee outside and then preparing for the first set of presentations.